Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kevin Hall. I have the honor and privilege of being the president of the University of Victoria, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to an amazing edition of Game Changers. I first want to start out with a big shout out to our School of Music and to Sonia Skagstead, whose song Road Less Traveled was featured in the opening music. And Road Less Traveled was performed by Sonia along with Steve Berg on guitar and recorded and engineered by Lindsay Gilroy. So thanks to all of you for that music. I wish to begin by acknowledging land and language, and I acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen people on whose lands the university stands, and to the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose traditional relationship with the land continues to today. Now, I pay my respects to elders past and present, and also pledge to walk the path to reconciliation together. Got a little bit of housekeeping before we start off. First of all, the live captioning and sign language interpretation are both available today. Check out the chat for information on how to check out the live transcripts. And we're also recording this webinar for members of our community who can't join us today. We're going to use Slido for questions and answers, something we've used quite a bit at the university over the last few years. So follow today's discussion and we'll open the floor. Following this discussion, we'll open the floor to questions, and you could submit your questions through Slido. The instructions for Slido are in the Zoom chat, and there's a link you can click on just to take you right away to our Slido. So welcome again, everybody, and thanks for joining us for our online conversation with our UVic Impact Chairs. And before we get started, I wanted to share with you how much I appreciate being able to host Game Changers. It's really great to have the opportunity to connect to our wider campus and to connect out into our community with some of the talented researchers and leaders at the University of Victoria. So without further ado, I really want to get into this discussion and to find out more about our three speakers today. Our speakers are Amanda Bates, the Impact Chair in Ocean Ecosystems, Change and Conservation; Heather Castleden, the Impact Chair in Transformational Governance for Planetary Health; and Carey Newman, the Impact Chair in Indigenous Practices. And so let's dive right into the conversation. And so, I didn't really introduce you very well on purpose, because what I'd like each of you to do is think about how you'd like to situate yourself in relation to this conversation that we have, and give us any biographical information that you think is worth sharing with the audience. And so let's start with Heather. Over to you, Heather.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin, for that short and sweet introduction, actually. It gives me a chance to just say who I am and where I'm coming from. As you mentioned, my name's Heather, and Heather is the name given to a flowering evergreen plant that thrives in the peaty barren lands of Scotland, where my ancestors are from. So I identify as a white settler researcher. And I've had the real honor of living in many, many Indigenous territories across this country, and received teachings from many generous and very patient Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers over the years. I'm really grateful, thrilled to be living in Lekwungen speaking territories, the homelands of the Songhees, Wasanich, and Esquimalt peoples. And I really want to acknowledge my deep respect and appreciation for their close and continuing relationship to the land, waters, and air around us. And I'm really committed to learning how to be a good visitor here to support others in their own learning journeys. And I think that's maybe something I'll touch on later about disruption and how we all have a lot of learning to do. It's lifelong, absolutely. And maybe just a little bit more about sort of my background. I'm trained as a human geographer. My earlier career was as an American Sign Language interpreter, but I got so excited about lifelong learning that I went back to university, and I've just never left. It's nice to get paid to do it now. Yeah, so human geography, and I do community-based participatory research. Most of my work is in solidarity with Indigenous peoples across the country, in their communities, with their organizations and nations on their priority issues that happen to fall within my areas of expertise. So I look at the nexus of cultures, places, power, resistance, relational ethics, and I use participatory, qualitative, and decolonizing research methodologies. My research group focuses on reconciliatory, respectful, reciprocal, and responsible community-led participatory research. And we tend to focus on social justice issues, environmental racism, health equity, governance, and of course, planetary health, I guess, which is where the title of this chair comes from. So I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you, Kevin.
Great. Thanks, Heather. And thanks for sharing that story with us. It's really important that people can situate themselves how they wish to be situated. And Carey, you know, it seems to be not a day goes by in the news these days when I don't see Carey Newman talking about something. Pretty popular guy in the media. What would you like this audience to know about Carey Newman?
I guess I'll start with my traditional introduction. So yo, Nuguam, Carey Newman, Heyman Bakon Pla'i, Hiles Kingume. I come from the Kukwekum, Giksam, and Wallabai clans of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation, which is on the northern end of what's currently known as Vancouver Island, as well as from Chiam of the Stalo Nation, which is Coast Salish territory along the Upper Fraser Valley. That's through my dad. Through my mom, I'm English, Irish, Scottish, settler stock from Saskatchewan. And maybe something important to know about me in this role is that I come to it in maybe through an unconventional pathway. I'm an artist by practice, something that's been passed down to me through generations. And at a point in my life around 2008, maybe a bit before that, I started to take on some projects that had an element of community engagement to them. And that was the first time that I pulled myself out of my studio and started working with people and community. And it transformed my practice. It transformed who I am as a person. And maybe it transformed my understanding of what art can be. So as the impact chair in Indigenous art practices, which is a cross appointment between visual arts and art history visual studies, I bring that experience, that the ideas that come from Indigenous epistemologies, for me particularly Kwakwaka'wakw ways. I bring the experience of making art that's about something socially relevant. And for me, that often has to do with colonialism, figuring out how to challenge, confront, transform colonial structures. It often has to do with reconciliation. And being here at the university has enabled me to work with so many different Indigenous scholars, so many different people who work on similar things, but maybe from different angles, right? Maybe from different faculties, departments, and find ways to create reciprocal relationship between the things that I do and the research that other people do, so that the art is informing the research and the research is informing the art in ways maybe that break the mold a little bit, maybe that help to achieve some of those things around trans and interdisciplinary work that we strive for in our institutions, but don't necessarily always have the answer for how to do in a good way. And so I think maybe as an impact chair, that's one of the things that was made really clear to me in the process of assuming this role, that it's meant to convene, it's meant to bring people together. And thankfully for me, that's a large part of what my artistic practice is, and hopefully continues to be. So that's a little bit about who I am.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carey, and thanks for sharing that story about yourself with us. Amanda, you're relatively new to UVic, as are most of us, I guess. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Kevin. So I'm a white colonialist settler. I grew up in Oklahoma, and that gave me a really unique perspective for the world, because we lived on 1,000 acres with no running water, no electricity. Imagine that. So I go into a museum now, a colonialist museum, and I'll see washing boards and like metal irons, and I actually remember using those. So that feels like a unique perspective on the world, where there was no pollution or damage, and I spent most of my time kind of outside. And being a kind of a white settler comes with a lot of, I guess, history, and in the theme of reconciliation, kind of re-understanding how you are in the world. But there were a few things that I feel were gifts, and one of them was a love of pie. And I think every white settler can identify this. A flaky pie with like berries and apples, the flakiest crust that you can imagine, that can cure many, many things. And I also really grew up with a respect and a love of land and nature. And that, I think, is instilled and changed the choices I've made throughout my whole life, like coming to UVic, where we have this extraordinary campus with beautiful trees. And I think people that are very like-minded in their respect and love and appreciation for nature. And I remember moving from this desert with pine trees that was very dry and coming to what we call Chilliwack, which is the Stoll Nation, and just like being blown away by the rain on cedars and the rivers, and going to the ocean and seeing this incredible place. So I feel very privileged, Kevin, to come back to UVic. I feel like this is my home. And I started my journey at the Banfield Marine Sciences Center, and was very connected with community there. I think many of us have. And so this place is so special to me. But I've also been abroad for 12 years. I've spent time at 8 different institutions. And so I have that perspective of these shared challenges at these institutions. And I come at this as a first generation, white female scientist who's seen a lot of change in the system through time. But I can also see that there's a lot of change that we need to move through. And I just feel so excited to be a part of the impact chairs with Heather and Carey, who are so uplifting, inspiring, and to be a part of this. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. Or thanks, Amanda. Thanks. This is terrific that you're sharing that story. I think there's a common thread with all of you. You all got very different backgrounds. But the common thread is really this piece around what you're doing and the impact that it creates. And I think appropriately, this is why you've been appointed as UVic's impact chairs. And one of the things that really strikes me as unique, having the 3 of you in this position, is how you actually work together, and how you're wanting to work together to come to some common goals. And Carey mentioned in his introduction the importance of interdisciplinarity and convening. And I think my knowledge of the 3 of you is this is something you take very seriously in this role, and I think it really adds value to the university. And so, what I'd like to explore a little bit is these unique roles you have as UVic's impact chairs. There's 3 impact chairs at UVic. The 3 of you are here. Tell me how you see this role fitting in your life and what you're doing and your research and your commitment to education, and including how you might see yourselves working together on some of the projects that you're undertaking over the next little while. And perhaps, Carey, I can start with you to sort of give us some insight into your role as the impact chair. Where do you see this going, and what are sort of the opportunities, perhaps challenges, and where you see things going together?
Yeah, I guess I started answering this a little bit in my introduction, maybe got ahead of myself, but I think that one of the big opportunities that comes with this particular impact chair is it offers all of these different points of connection. Art is often sort of seen as something that is meant to illustrate or translate, and it isn't always understood as generative and a form of research in and of itself. It also isn't always understood as having the potential to impact other areas of research. But creative thought is at the heart of all forms of innovation, right? The ways that we go through connecting different aspects of whatever our particular area of expertise is pretty critical to breaking new ground, to figuring out new solutions to old problems. And I think that having this position and having and maybe the platform that comes with it offers the opportunity for me to talk about this and to be heard, and to be part of conversations around the larger structural planning of the institution. You mentioned being in the news, and I think that this position is part of that, right? Like, it isn't always, because there are some times when people just want to hear from an Indigenous artist because they think that it might have some relationship to an Indigenous issue. But there are other times when they're looking for a quote expert, right? And although I don't ever label myself as such, the title does give that. Now, the way we've only had a couple of times for the three of us to have deeper conversation, but every single time we have a conversation, we uncover new areas of common interest. I've worked quite a bit with Heather on projects like the Archipelagos Collective. And even in the couple of conversations that we had leading up to this event, found a whole bunch of different areas where Amanda and I have maybe not the same challenges that we face, but challenges that are created by the same structures. Mm-hmm. So we have common interests in how to move through those. And it's pretty exciting to have this conversation to begin with, but also to know that we can continue to come together to bring the different areas that we think and care about into conversation with one another to address those maybe broader issues that transcend or exist beyond the area of focus that each of us have.
Yeah, thanks, Carey. And Amanda, you're the impact chair in ocean ecosystems change. I mean, that's a global problem. That's a huge problem. Yeah. Oceans are big, and I'm sure there's a ton of work to do in that. And how does the impact chair position affect both your work that you're doing now as a scientist looking at ocean change, but also, as Carey said, the connections you're now making between yourself and Heather and Carey? Is there something that's going to create additional opportunities in your own research career?
Yeah, so Kevin, that's a great question. I like how you phrased that. I guess I've held the Canada Research Chair, and in that I felt like my task was about research excellence. But this impact chair was so exciting, and I was really happy to apply for it because, I don't know, it felt a little different, and I still feel like we're shaping what our impact chairs are, and we're doing it together, which is also quite exciting. But I feel like what this allows you to do is step away from just the science excellence and think about what is impact. Mm-hmm. So when I first started and I first applied for the job, I thought about impact as conservation impact. So impact of what I'm actually doing with communities. And now I'm starting to think, in what Heather and Carey in our discussions have inspired, is the impact is actually how we act as leaders and how we can act as leaders collectively to think about where shared processes such as convening, how do you bring teams of people together with very diverse perspectives, diverse needs, what are the processes that we can put in place, because the processes support that goal of bringing people together, and where do we have challenges in the systems and structures that are there that put blockers up against the processes that we need to get our diverse voices that are actually going to be innovative. And so in terms of my own work, at all layers of what I'm doing, I'm working with large teams of people, large policymakers, to bringing kind of global data together. But then I'm also working locally with communities and really trying to develop authentic relationships with people. And so I think that's where the strength of the conversations that I've had with Heather and Carey so far, and where I'm uplifted and inspired, because it's we can all make mistakes, we can all rethink our actions, But if you're authentic and real in those relationships and you're coming from a place with like good intent, that's where we can start to build, real change. And I hope UVic will be a leader in this way with all of our space in place as we move forwards.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Amanda. And I guess that goal to create real change is the thing that should drive us all, right? As researchers. Heather, you've also got you got a big title in yours. Your planetary health. That's also another big challenge. But I know your background's in participatory research, which is in some respects it really sets you up well to convene and bring people together. And I do know that you hit the ground running. You weren't here more than a few months, and you're building a team of 40 people or so for this Archipelagos project, which is fantastic. But what is the impact chair to you? How do you see it positioning yourself for driving that change that we've all been talking about? And I know you're also very keen on working with your other two colleagues here that are impact chairs. And so what's it all about for you?
Sure. Well, confession is that I've applied multiple times to come to UVic. I did my postdoc here. I always wanted to come back. Some of my most important teachers are New Chalnoth peoples, where I did my PhD research. So I've always wanted to come back to this territory. And when this job came up, I'm like, well, this is a bit of a stretch. I'm not sure that I can do this job, but I'm still going to apply for it. And I felt like it needed to come with a cape, because I felt like anybody that takes on this title is going to save the world, but that's just not me, right? It's a all hands on deck kind of gig. But yeah, I think doing community-based participatory research means that you're working with a real diversity of people. And one of the most important things I think in that kind of work is listening. And so as much as, these impact chairs are for only 5 years, and there's a lot of excitement around them when they're posted and when you bring in the person that you want, et cetera, and then you want them to hit the ground running. And part of my approach, I guess I'm known in my discipline as, you wrote the paper about drinking tea for a year before doing anything. And so on the one hand, I started out in this job going, okay, I'm going to just spend the first year listening. But, the amazing people that I started to meet here on campus, and I want to give a nod to the UVic and the Anthropocene group that is an informal collective of people, and just bouncing some ideas around them. And it was already a very rich transdisciplinary group or multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary group. And I started to think about what is the responsibility of an impact chair? And it is about convening people. It's not just about doing your own research. And I started to meet, of course, a lot of the Indigenous scholars and artists and activists in this area. And sometimes we all wear multiple hats, right? Sometimes we're an artist, activist, and an academic like Carey. And I just was thinking, one of the things that I'm trained at is convening, yes, but also grant writing. And so, and managing large grants, because I also had a Canada Research Chair at my previous institution. And so I thought, well, that's a responsibility that I can bring to this work, that it can be disruptive, because I know we're going to be talking about disruptive work, and that we can rethink the way we understand what the role of what we call a nominated principal investigator is, that really that's the person who's the helper to help make things happen, but allow those who are doing all of these interesting, unique projects across the board, allow that focus to maintain. And I'll do the sort of the behind the scenes grunt work of grant writing and CVs and this and that and the other. And the Archipelagos team was actually 80 of us, but that's a really exciting proposal. And I think, what's really neat about that, Amanda and Carey are both involved because they bring different unique strengths. And we have engineers like yourself, Kevin, who are also involved in the work. And I think, the way we're exploring that work is also around transforming the way we understand how does a research project work? It doesn't have to be hierarchical. It can be circular in nature. And I think I bring that sort of discussion everywhere I go, is that we can rethink governance structures. The challenge is that what we are used to is pretty comfortable for those who are in positions of power, who are not, who are oftentimes in positions of power because of their white privilege. And so me bringing in that part of the conversation can be really uncomfortable. But so I think part of my job as an impact chair is to make people uncomfortable, but as a way of calling them in to rethink the way we're doing things.
Yeah, I think that's terrific, and lots of good thoughts in there. I want to pick up on one word that you actually mentioned, which is disruption and being disruptive, and I think that's a fantastic conversation to have. You know, universities are these very old monolithic structures that are built on whatever it is, 16th century tradition that we don't seem to change very well. And I often used to say universities move at the speed of the glaciers, but of course with climate change, universities are much slower than the glaciers now. And that comes with sort of institutional structures and governance. And I'd be interested in some of your ideas as a collective group about how do we break down, reimagine, or rethink institutional structures, whether it's universities or other structures that exist out there in society, which really restrict us from accomplishing the goals that we want and the change we want. And of course, that's going to take disruption. So I think it's a really appropriate word. And so perhaps, Amanda, I can start with you to share some of your ideas on how do we sort of break down and rethink the way we do things as a society or as a university or as a group of collective individuals.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. So I actually thought what I'd do today is just start from a personal perspective. And you know, Heather actually studies this. So I thought I'd start with that perspective from science and then pass off, because I love listening to Heather and Carey talk about this. It's amazing. You know, when I think about this and take a step back from my outrage, and I realize you really have to do that to kind of see the change. And things are changing, and you can feel that thread and that pulse of that change. And we're eager for change. I think we all are. But, you know, even so, there was a paper that was published last week in Nature with thousands of respondents from around the world in marine science. And there was this alarming kind of incidence of abuse of power and aggression and acts of anger in marine science. So 75% of early career researchers have experienced some sort of active aggression and abuse. And so when you take, that's kind of shocking. It's kind of shocking. So why is that? And so I guess what I'd like to talk about a little bit is disrupting this power that we have as professors. Because if we think about the structure of the university system, professors are awesome, right? They have this power to create courses and learning experiences. We don't have a lot of accountability in some ways for what we do, and we have this amazing freedom to create these situations and experiences for our undergrads and our graduate students and our postdocs. So that can be a great experience, but we all also know that you know, that can lead to, I guess it's an abuse of power in essence. So the thing is that this is actually quite easy to disrupt, because we can think about some transparent power dynamics. So I thought I'd just come up with a couple of examples from my own experience that I think are really easy to change the power dynamic a little bit as professors. And so one example is that we have these structures in science. For instance, when you do a PhD, you have something called this candidacy exam. And I remember doing this at UVic. I was terrified. I was oh, I'm going to get kicked out. I'm clearly not smart enough to be here. But you know, if you actually think about what that's there for, it's actually there as a learning experience. It's this amazing time where you have this 4 months as a PhD student to sit and learn about whatever you want. And it actually sticks in your mind, because you're not doing 30 billion other things looking after kids often. You're actually able to focus. And so when you start sharing that that's what it's for and why it's for, it changes that power dynamic slightly, because it's for that person. And so communicating that is really, really key. So I think we can even with structures that are in place that we might want to change, we might want to think about how we communicate those structures to people that we work with in our teams. And then I guess some other issues are around like identifying what actions you can take and understanding what resources are available to you. And I have a personal example because my daughter is autistic and she's going through the science program for the first time, and she cannot learn without her headset on. So she goes to the chemistry lab. She needs to take them off. It's a health and safety issue. So she ends up in my office in tears. So second generation academic. I just say, well, we have this wonderful Center for Accessible Learning. They're amazing. Why don't you go talk to them? So off she did. They're sorting it. There's a support structure for her that she might not have been empowered to connect with had she not known that it was there. So I do think there's actually a lot of support structures that are available to us. And if we don't know about them and we don't know who to ask, then you can't necessarily access those support structures. So I'd love as professors for us to be better at communicating what is available to empower these incredible early career people that are coming up through this system, because there are resources available. And then I guess that leads to also, if you're empowered, then sometimes as early career researchers, you can achieve things that faculty cannot. And I have an amazing example of this. I literally, with my colleagues, spent a year probably collectively of time working on a health and safety issue at a previous university. So we worked on this. It was kind of a running joke. We put in a whole bunch of meetings and on and on and on. If you search for this in my email, you come up with hundreds of emails. Well, one of my students decided that she would band together with a bunch of grad students and basically connected with the president and had that shift in that dynamic, communicated about why this was an issue, and it rapidly changed. And as a faculty member, I was like, what? Oh, that's amazing. Like, you just made this happen. So I think there are examples, and I think empowering, the amazing people that we work with is a really key aspect of this. So that's, I guess, my disruption, and I can hand back to Kevin to move to the people who actually work on this
Oh, thanks, Matt. That's terrific, and I think your comments around the importance of communications, of proper communications, to actually let people know what's going on is really, really keen. And also, your last example really articulated the importance of letting people know what actually some of the issues are as well, because that's often a communications issue as well, that perhaps different people don't know that this is happening or this is an issue. So that's fantastic. So Heather, you've got transformational governance in your title. So I'm expecting disruption is within your tool set. And talking about breaking down and rethinking and reimagining institutional structures. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I think there are times, and I said this at a research event last fall, about there are times for drinking tea, and then there's times for, I may have used an expletive before, I won't now, but there's times for butt kicking. And the thing is, with the disruption part, it does make people feel uncomfortable for sure. It's not, diplomacy, it can be very effective, but also when you're calling out, it's also calling in, like taking a moment to be honest about what's really happening, for people who you're engaging with, to have the humility to recognize that we make mistakes, but that we can learn from our mistakes and take ownership of them. And that there's, I guess, hope and humor are two of the other things that really come to my mind about the importance of using humor and recognizing, our own limitations, that, we can do so much more as a collective than we can individually. But I was having a bit of a giggle about Amanda calling us Harry, and it's because Carey and Heather, Carey and I were trying to come up with a way of going into a grant application as co-principal investigators, because you just can't in our funding structures. But we both recognize that we both could be the leaders here. And how could we mash our names together so that we didn't come up with Harry, but we should have. So I just love that. And I think that's also just part of the disruptive processes that I go through, like with, this is the way things are done, and no, we can't do that, are like sort of the sparks for lighting a fire for me to want to say, well, just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean we have to keep doing it that way. We're pointing out some problems with how it is, so let's try something different. And because I'm a researcher, one of the things that I do is then I turn, the research spotlight on something. Yeah. And I've done that in the context of the research ethics board's processes around where did they originate? They originated in response to the horrific abuses around Nazi Germany, and when doctors were experimenting without consent on those individuals. And so it transpired in a medical context, in a lab, a controlled kind of environment. But I work in a natural inquiry situation. And so the ethics don't always translate. Mm-hmm. So this policy that's been created, the Tri-Council policy on human research ethics, was good, but it needed improvement. It needed transformational understanding. And so the way to do that is engaging with those who are most affected. So not coming up with policies over there in the ivory tower where we're in, or up in Ottawa or other provincial seats of power. It's about engaging with the people who are affected most by whatever policy you're creating, and going, is this actually a good policy? And even better is to come with a blank page and not say, hey, this is what we're thinking, but more like, what should we be thinking about? What are the questions we should be asking? And then going from there. And I just think that, time and again, I see that in not just the research ethics processes at a university, but in the financial processes. And I think it speaks to the point about, again, the drinking tea sort of concept is when I've had challenges with institutional structures, and I butt up against them a lot because of the community-based participatory approach. I know that I'm making an impact in communities when they invite me back. So it's kind of like getting tenure, like, okay, so I'm actually doing an okay job. That's good to know. But when I'm having problems at the institutional level, I could just complain about it and grumble about it, or I could do something about it. And one of the best ways to do something about it is a face-to-face conversation. It's not writing a letter. It's a face-to-face conversation to try to come to some mutual understanding of like, what's the issue? And so, I spent time drinking tea with financial services back at Dalhousie at my first institution, with the VP research being the intervener because I was threatening to send my money back to CIHR, saying I can't do my job. I thought we were all on the same team together, right? Yeah. So I think face-to-face, shifting our governance structures from being ones that are top down and pyramidal that way to ones that are more circular in nature. And co-governance, co-creation of policy, you name it. It can happen. It's, do we want to allow it to happen? And by we, I mean, typically I'm talking about the white structures that control every aspect of our lives, and we can disrupt that. Are we brave enough to? People with power, are they willing to give it up? Right? Yeah.
Thanks, Heather, and also thanks for reminding us about the importance of actually sitting down and talking. In this new digital world, it's so easy to send a text, an email, do a Zoom, but actually getting together, as you say, it can really start the problem solving issues going. So lots there. Carey, before we get to you, I'm just going to remind people to jump onto Slido if you have questions. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions. And Carey, I know you're disruptive. I've had personal experience with you, with something called the Uncenter, which is anything but a center. And I know you're really thinking a lot about the structures that are in place in society in general. And reimagining what they could be. And I think your imagination and your ideas are fantastic. So let me turn it over to you to talk about some of your ideas about breaking down these barriers and kind of rethinking and reimagining institutional structures.
Sure, thanks. I guess I kind of take a couple of different approaches. I don't think change happens because of one act or one person or one process. So, you know, when I arrived at the university and I was invited into different conversations about EDI and about decolonization and indigenization, I went in not knowing a whole lot about academic structures. And the example that Heather shared about the ethics review process and how it was better suited to one set of circumstances than another is something that I would draw a parallel to with my experience in approaching like EDI as a group, because we have these different processes or structures that are put in place with good purpose in the same way that the ethics review process was put in place. And I'm talking about collegial governance and academic freedom and the way that they were put in place to protect researchers so that we could continue to think and challenge and disrupt, right? But I've also found that there are times when those exact same structures are used to slow down, inhibit, or restrict progress. And the example I have is talking about representation in our EDI conversations. And if you ask the room, everybody says, yes, we want to have better representation. Then we say, well, how are we going to do it? And the conversation immediately starts to disintegrate because people have lots of different ideas, which is fun. That's important. But when we say, well, the first thing we need to do to make a wide, diverse student body feel seen and part of what they're here to learn is to ensure that our curriculum reflects them. So we need to start with that. And the next response is, well, we can't mandate that because academic freedom stops us from being able to do that. So it's an example of something that's put in place for good purpose, but is it being used for the purpose it was put in place for, or is it being used to uphold a status quo that privileges a particular demographic? And there's lots of other examples that are similar around the way that we use privacy to within our voting structures to ensure that people can have a free and unencumbered vote that is outside of influence. That also enables people who want to vote in their own interest to escape accountability. So when we're trying to make a big disruptive type of change, like decolonization, let's do that, right? But we need to bring in people who are willing to make those changes into our leadership positions. And that's uncomfortable. So maybe we need to slow this down. The best way to slow it down is to vote. We don't know who voted which way. We just know that we don't get that kind of change happening. And so that privacy is used to protect that person, right? So the second layer of disruption, I guess that's one, right? To start to call out the different ways that things are used against their intended purpose. The other one is that if we always spend our time working inside of those structures and rearranging the furniture, changing the color of the walls, changing the artwork that we're looking at, then it's always a response. And so it's being dictated by the structure that we're trying to change. So that's where the uncenter comes in, because the idea for the uncenter is to create something that exists outside of, you said anything but a center, that exists outside of these structures so that we can spend time reimagining them and building something with a different foundation. Yeah. And hopefully those things then become seeds that can be planted in different parts of the larger structure. One of the lines I use to describe this is, we can't wake up to tomorrow to a decolonized institution, but we could wake up to a decolonized, or as much as is possible, a decolonized place to work. So that's the idea. I'm now calling it the Mayakala Center for Arts and Decolonization, because once again, because the funding that we're going after for it doesn't understand what an uncenter is, and so it's much easier to describe and to convince them that a center about these disruptions is important. And the last example I'll talk about is this project that I've been working on, and I've started calling it an ongoing conceptual art project, the Seedling, and it's starting to find its way into different projects that we're doing here at the university. But the idea is to plant a tree, to design a totem in virtual 3D, and to have this university agree to make and raise the pole when the tree is mature. And it's a simple idea, but it cascades a whole bunch of really interesting transdisciplinary challenges. And what I think is most exciting about it for me is that when you spend your life and your practice fighting against the reality of colonialism that's so pervasive that Indigenous people, that no Indigenous person in this country can grow up escaping those harms. We all bear the scars of colonialism in some way. This proposes something that exists in a time beyond that. And therefore, using the language of resurgence, it gets to exist on its own terms. So when we're talking about disruption, about transformative change, if we can start to imagine things that aren't a reaction to the problems that we face, but exist beyond the problem, then that can guide us through. And so by putting this totem way in the future, totems come from pre-colonial times. That the culture that developed them was unaffected by colonialism. And by putting this totem 600 years into the future and forging the path there, it's exciting to me that the people who get to see that and make that may be able to do it free from the cloud of colonialism that exists all around us in the reality that we're in right now. So it's not sort of naive optimism, but it is optimism and it is hopeful. And when you spent a lifetime, or maybe the last decade, working on a project like the Witness Blanket that is really explicitly about creating awareness of colonial past and traumatic harms, this feels like something that breathes life back into what was the target of residential schools, of so many of the different colonial projects that Indigenous people in Canada have faced.
Well, Carey, thanks. And a lot to unpack there and a lot to think about. And I could go on all day talking to you, but I want to make sure we get a chance to have a couple of questions from the audience. So perhaps we could turn over to the Q&A and pull up the first question. All right. So can you describe a scenario in which Indigenous art, ocean ecosystems, and planetary health intersect to create a new pathway for understanding? That's a question from Dwight Owen. So thank you, Dwight. Does anybody want to jump in on that one?
I feel like that Carey's description of the Seedling project tackles that quite nicely, actually, because, and I won't speak to ocean ecosystems, I'll let Amanda do that, but I do know from my time with Nuu-chah-nulth peoples about the relationship between healthy lands and healthy people, and specifically about the trifecta relationship between salmon, who are coming upstream from the ocean, that are feeding the trees as they spawn and then die at the end of the rivers, and that by nurturing the trees with their nutrients, it creates safe homes for people, in the sense of it's a healthy land, healthy water, healthy air. So to me, that was a brilliant example of Carey's project, The Seedling. And it's what I also love about it is it doesn't fit with a fiscal year, a political term, a lifetime. We're talking like a 7-generation kind of approach to thinking. And I think if we could apply that kind of idea that Carey's got across the board in our governance structures, we're going to be doing a lot towards planetary health.
Fantastic.
I might offer the word Owitnikula, which is a Kwakwala word meaning to live in good relationship with the land, air, water, spirit worlds, and everything in them. All of these things are interconnected inherently, right? Like the decisions we make in our governance procedures affect our ocean ecosystems, our planetary health. And when they're restricted by political timelines or economic timelines, we're not making those 7-generation or 600-year plans that are necessary to guide our behavior. And we're starting to make decisions based on those instead of prioritizing a much longer scale view. So I don't know what the art would be in bringing all of this together, but it feels, Heather, like you're right. Like the seedling does have interconnections with this question.
Great, thanks for that. Let's see if we can squeak in one more question. I know we're tight on time, but let's put up the next question. How will you know that your work is and will be impactful? That's from the Zoom chat room. And Amanda, maybe we could flick this one to you.
Yeah, I think this is really important, especially when we're thinking about conservation or science and we're kind of bounded by traditional ways of thinking. So in some of the projects I'm working with, for instance, with my Inuit colleagues in Nunatsiavut, we're thinking about like what is impact for the community, and impact is about well-being. So it's the well-being of our colleagues as we're moving forward. It's about whether or not we're invited and working with our colleagues to input to Imapivut, which is the ocean kind of plan. And I think impact is about those relationships and the continuity of those relationships as you move forwards. So it really resonated when Heather mentioned earlier that impact was about being invited back. And again, it comes back to these human relationships and thinking about humans. So that's one way that we're measuring impact in our project is about the continuity of relationships.
Fantastic. Carey, Heather, any closing thoughts on how you know when impact is reached?
I guess I would just say it's not about how many times I'm cited. That's for sure. I know that, that when we think about impact, it's like, oh, how well known are you? That's just a very Western way of thinking about impact. Or, I do a research program around Indigenous leadership and renewable energy, but the impact isn't about how many less barrels of diesel. I don't know if it's barrels actually, but how much less diesel is shipped to, say, a remote community. The impact is how much autonomy does that particular Indigenous community have around what energy choices they want to make. And so the impact in that case is that they had full autonomy to make those decisions and are not beholden to a corporate structure or something like that, like with regulatory framework that you have to fit into, with tying into a grid, but having autonomy, I guess, and self-determination. That when I see instances of that happening, I think, okay, the work that we're doing is impactful. And I think, we're trying to get a large research program on archipelagos of Indigenous-led resurgence for planetary health funded, but we also know the work's happening without the funding. The impact is already taking place because, all of the things that are happening in these different little spaces are, coming together and creating a wave, I think, to address. So I guess I'm hopeful that the impact is happening already with or without the grant funding.
Thanks, Heather. And Carey, any final thoughts in the last 30 seconds or so?
I think that impact for me comes when the change that we seek becomes apparent in the lives that we live. my dad attended residential school. I was homeschooled, which was part of my non-traditional pathway into academia. And my daughter is going to school and learning about the things that happened to my dad. So I can see in those 3 generations, things are changing, and it might not be changing at a speed that I want them to, but transformation of consciousness is the impact that I seek. I don't know how to measure it, but I know that the artwork that is made by artists all over this country, by people in this university, is part of creating that change and creating that impact.
Great, thanks, Carey. And it's time to wrap up, but I want to thank everybody for the fantastic questions they sent in. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to get to more of the questions, but I also really want to thank our impact chairs, Heather, Amanda, and Carey, for an absolutely engaging discussion. We could have kept going all afternoon, I think, to talk about some great ideas that you have. Also wanted to thank Jess, who's the ASL interpreter, Jen for the live captions, Jeff and Jordan from Media Services, and Morgan from Ceremonies for really putting this together today. And of course, my team in the Office of the President who puts on these Game Changer series. I think we just had a fantastic discussion today. Everybody's going to walk away from this much richer and be able to think about things in a different way. So I just thank the 3 of you again for all the work you're doing on behalf of the university and actually for choosing to work at UVic, because I think it's a commitment of people like you that are going to make UVic a much better place in the future. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It's been a great event, and hope to see you at the next Game Changers.
Yeah, Castleden.